welcome everyone. If you missed it a couple seconds ago, if you're willing to introduce yourself in the chat and your name, your location, and who you're affiliated with, we'd love to hear more about you as we're starting the session. I'm Mariah McIntosh. I work for the Intermountain West Joint Venture, and I'm facilitating the Pinyon-Juniper Management Network. So you're here at an Ask an Expert panel session for the network. I'll go ahead and who we are. The Pinyon-Juniper focus on managers in Pinyon-Juniper woodlands. And we're here to facilitate knowledge exchange and connection on topics like fire risk, drought, insects and disease, wildlife habitat, and more. And so this network we started this early this spring, and we're sort of building the network and learning more about what we can do to support managers in these ecosystems. So you'll hear more from us if you've joined our mailing list. The website is right here on the slide, and we'll add that into the chat shortly. And so this is one of a number of sessions that we've hosted on various themes, and there'll be more coming as well. One last note is just sadly having internet problems. I'm going to keep my camera off, and hopefully I'll be able to pop back on later, but I want to make sure that my audio is coming through smoothly. So for today's session, we'll be focusing on our Ask an Expert panel. So we'll be addressing questions that we've sort of crowdsourced from this group. If you were a part of our first session, we spent most of the time asking the group what are the topics that you'd like more information about, products that you're interested in, basically just the ways that this network can support you as managers in Pinyon-Juniper woodlands. And so we've sort of used those questions to inform this panel. And one part of this community of practice is that we like to be as interactive as we can. It can be a little bit challenging virtually and in sort of large Zoom meetings, but we always try to emphasize discussion and have the opportunity for folks to ask questions, participate in the conversation. We have a great panel of experts, but we also recognize that there is extensive expertise within the participants in this session as well, and that all of you are experts in the places that you work. So we'd love to hear from you as a part of our discussion. So the format of the panel will be a series of prepared questions that, like I mentioned, were sort of crowdsourced from this group. So we've sort of selected from those and tried to kind of address some of the topics that were of greatest interest to people, and given our panelists a time to kind of think about those ahead of time. And then we'll transition over to allowing additional questions and discussion from the group. So as a heads up, in case you're a person that likes to know about this in advance, we would love to ask you towards the end of the session to turn on your camera. So if you need to like finish eating your lunch or whatever it may be, we'd totally love to see your face at the end of the session. We understand if that's not possible. I guess it's a little silly for me to be saying that here with my camera off, but yes, we'd love to have you do that at the end. And we'll prioritize folks sort of asking their questions out loud, unmuting and doing that. But we also do have the Q&A tool. So if you'd like to just type your question in there, just in case you might forget it, or you don't want to unmute for some reason, you're welcome to use that as well. So I'm gonna quickly introduce the panelists that we have here, and then we'll go off the slides so that you can see them a little bit better, and so that they can sort of talk a little bit more in depth about their experience and the ecosystems that they've worked in. So first, and I'd like to say we're really excited about this panel, and that when we sort of started putting this group together, we were looking for kind of a wide range of expertise, experience, perspectives, as well as trying to cover a good chunk of the Intermountain region. So one thing we've talked about a lot in this group is that there's quite a lot of variability across the Pinyon-Juniper region, I guess biomes, maybe not the correct term, but across areas that have pinyon juniper woodlands. And so we really want to be sort of careful about being explicit about the places that we're talking about, because something that's true in one place may not be true in another place. So I'll have folks kind of talk a bit more about the areas that they have worked, and we'll try to be clear about kind of what types of woodlands and what areas we're talking about throughout the session. So first, I'd like to introduce Jean Chambers. She's an emeritus senior scientist with the USDA Forest Service Rocky Mountain Research Station. She's a plant ecologist located in Reno, Nevada, and much of her work focuses on understanding the factors that influence ecological resilience or recovery potential following wildfire and resistance to invasive annual grasses across the diverse ecosystems of the Intermountain West. Second, we have Peter Weisberg, a professor of landscape ecology at the University of Nevada, Reno. His research focuses on the ecology of dryland ecosystems and semi-arid woodlands, as well as forests, including large-scale vegetation changes that have arisen from altered disturbance regimes, climate change, and exotic plant invasions. And Peter has an extensive background in studying pinyon-juniper woodlands, having focused a large portion of his research program on these ecosystems over the past 2 decades. Next, we have Diane Maston-Dixon, who is a field specialist for the U.S. Wildland Fire Service Rocky Mountain Geographic Area and was previously the Fuels Program Manager for BLM in Colorado. She's based out of Grand Junction. And Diane's work focuses on providing safe and effective response to wildland fire, restoring fire-adapted ecosystems on a landscape scale, and promoting fire-adapted communities. And then finally, Ellis Margolis is a research ecologist at the USGS Fort Collins Science Center, New Mexico Landscape Field Station in Santa Fe, New Mexico. Ellis received a PhD from the Laboratory of Tree Ring Research at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And his research focuses on the interactions between forest, fire, climate, and human land use, which inform the management of forested watersheds. So I'm going to stop sharing here for a second, and we'll just hear from these folks in their own words a little bit more about the ecosystems that they've worked in and their experience in pinyon-juniper woodlands, and we'll keep the same order. So go ahead, Jean.
Thanks, Mariah. I began my work in pinyon and juniper ecosystems by co-authoring a review of the seed and seedling ecology of the different pinyon-juniper species across the Intermountain West. Since then, I've led or collaborated on studies that have evaluated the establishment requirements of single-leaf pinyon and the implications for post-fire restoration. Most recently, these studies have been with Peter and Ali Urza. When we started seeing the mega fires in sagebrush and pinyon-juniper ecosystems in the early 2000s, I began working on fire ecology and management of these systems. I've been involved in multiple field studies to evaluate the effects of wildfire and of fuel treatments designed to decrease fire risk in our pinyon-juniper encroached shrublands. I'd like to throw out that one of the projects I've been a charter member of is the Sage Step Treatment Evaluation Project, which has fuel treatments in pinyon-juniper systems located across the Great Basin and is currently collecting the 20th year of data on those treatments. An underlying objective of all of my work has been to determine the most effective strategies for maintaining the ecological resilience or recovery potential of these systems and their resistance to invasive annual grasses and forbs. In addition to publishing on this work, my colleagues and I have developed a review of the ecology, history, ecohydrology, and management of pinyon-juniper ecosystems, guides for selecting appropriate fuel and restoration treatments in the Great Basin and Southwest pinyon-juniper ecosystems, and then most recently, a guide for identifying and managing old-growth woodlands. And I'd like to acknowledge that Rick Miller was the lead on most of our early reviews that we did for this system. So much of my work has been conducted in the Great Basin, but I've also been involved in larger scale work across the sagebrush biome and more recently in some of our Southwest shrublands. I work in pinyon and juniper woodlands because they are clearly a large and significant component of the Intermountain West. They have many resource values and are of significant cultural importance to Native Americans. However, pinyon-juniper encroachment into shrublands can result in a significant loss of ecological resilience and resistance to those invasive annual grasses and forbs. Acquiring the information needed to prioritize fuel and other management treatments, where they're going to have the greatest benefits for both our communities and natural resources, is key to sustaining and restoring both our shrublands and woodlands. Thanks.
So I guess I'm up next. Thanks, Jean, for that great intro, and thanks everybody for being here. And I'm glad to be here. So my experience working in Pinyon-Juniper woodlands, I guess, started over 20 years ago. I guess 23 years ago to be exact, when I moved to Reno. My very first project at UNR involved Robin Tausch and was doing a fire history of Pinyon-Juniper woodlands in the Shoshone Range in central Nevada. So I've studied pinyon-juniper woodland ecology using a combination of old school field research, dendroecology, and remote sensing approaches. In early years, my work focused on woodland expansion and fire history. More recently, drought response, woodland dieback and decline. And throughout, I've been interested in woodland responses to wildfire and to management activities. So I'm most familiar with the pinyon and juniper woodlands in the central Nevada Great Basin, though I've also worked in the bi-state area and the Eastern Sierra Front. And I've had collaborative projects that have given me experience with those Pinus edulis pinyon-juniper woodlands on the Colorado Plateau. But yeah, most of my familiarity is with Utah juniper single-leaf pinyon in the Nevada Great Basin. And why do I work in pinyon-juniper woodlands? Well, before my position at UNR, I mostly studied like taller statured forests like Douglas fir forests in Western Oregon and mountain forests in the Swiss Alps. But once I moved to Reno, once I arrived in Nevada, right away I fell in love with those Great Basin landscapes and the big expanses and the quiet and the lack of biting insects most of the year and all the good things. And I developed an appreciation for these gnarly old trees and young trees and well, trees of all ages, but especially the old ones that grow in some of the driest places where trees can be found anywhere in the world. So that drew my research attention to these systems that I just enjoyed being in and spending time in. So who's up next?
I think it's me. Well, thanks everyone for your time this afternoon. I'm really excited and grateful to be part of this panel. A big part of my job is to learn from Jean and Peter and Ellis and take their research and translate it into land management. So I am now with the Wildland Fire Service, our newly formed agency of the Department of the Interior Fire Programs. And I am part of the Rocky Mountain Geographic Area, covering Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, Nebraska, and South Dakota. I am more specifically focusing on the southern portion of our geographic area, so in Colorado, Kansas, and southern Nebraska. So a lot of my background is focused in Colorado, on the Colorado Plateau, but also thinking now about eastern Colorado transitioning down into the plains, some of the mixed grasslands that we have. And as we're going to discuss today, a lot of the perspectives on pinyon-juniper management vary a lot by region. So how it looks in the Great Basin, how it looks in the Colorado Plateau, and also thinking about how it looks in some of these areas getting into the plains. There's a lot of different situations, perspectives, strategies that we use for managing these ecosystems. So my background, I've been in fuels for a while, and previous to that, I was a natural resource specialist for BLM Colorado. And I focused a lot on sagebrush systems and interface with pinyon juniper. I did a lot of work for sage grouse, including land use authorizations, oil and gas permitting, right-of-way authorizations, but also habitat work, doing wet meadow restoration, other wildlife habitat improvement projects for other sagebrush obligates. And the interface between sagebrush and pinyon juniper is so pronounced that you can't really disentangle the two. And that got me very curious in these systems. And I spent a lot of time in these systems and trying to find the balance of how you manage for multiple objectives, multiple species, and also getting into fire risk reduction. Because as we've seen with some of these large fires that are happening, the conversion to cheatgrass is a real threat. So anything that we can do to prepare ahead of time gives us an opportunity to manage some of those disturbances as they happen. Before all of that, I also got my start in BLM as an AIM crew lead and a range tech. So spent a lot of time in the field doing monitoring, hiking around, getting bit by gnats because we could not always avoid the biting bug season. But hey, it builds character. And, you know, through all that, I've dug a lot of very rocky soil pits. I'm sure that that's going to be a topic we discuss later. And then in addition to my professional experience, I also own some land in Western Colorado. I'm about 10 miles south of Grand Junction at about 7,000 feet, right on a PJ sagebrush ecotone and surrounded by persistent woodland. So I literally think about these ecosystems every morning as I'm drinking my coffee on the porch. And I find a lot of beauty in these systems, much like Peter. I think some of those gnarled old trees, they make you feel a certain way. So have a lot of interest here. And I'm glad to be part of this generation that is currently working through some of the land management challenges with these systems, but also want to be part of the solution for supporting both ecological resilience and mitigating risk and helping my community do the same thing.
Great. Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here. I started PJ research and management approximately 15 years ago, leading a restoration project as part of the U.S. Forest Service Collaborative Restoration Forest Program, the CFRP. The project was on a large PJ savanna landscape just south of Santa Fe. So that's kind of where I got my feet wet. Since then, been involved in many research projects regarding fire and vegetation management. I'm sitting here in the BLM state office in New Mexico, so I talk with managers all the time, work with Forest Service and Park Service a lot, and so I'm always involved in discussions about PJ management and ecology. I've also had the pleasure of looking at the tree rings of at least 4 species of pinyon juniper trees. They're great. The tree rings are great, and these trees can get really old, as people have spoke about. So I really enjoyed that and feel lucky. Most familiar with Pinyon-Juniper systems in northern New Mexico with two-needle pinyon being the dominant pinyon, and one-seed juniper as well as Rocky Mountain juniper. I've also spent some time in southern New Mexico ecosystems where you get the cool alligator bark juniper down there. Those are cool trees and cool systems down by the Gila. And last, I had the pleasure of doing a tree ring sampling effort in Western juniper. We got some 2,000-year-old wood for some climate reconstruction. So I've been able to walk around in multiple PJ systems throughout my career. I work in PJ ecology in part because pinyon juniper is such an important ecosystem across the West. And if you live in New Mexico, right, there's piñones on the corner for sale all the time. It's part of the culture. I have 3 piñon in my backyard that I watch as I wake up every morning. Watch the needles, the bud bursts, and those sort of things. Watch the piñon jays go in there and getting the piñones out of them. And then a one-seed juniper just across the fence. So it's definitely PJ is part of life here in New Mexico.
Great. We're going to go ahead and start here on our first question. We've primarily, we won't be using slides, but I'm going to put the questions up and then Andrew will add them into the chat as well. And we have a couple of visuals select visuals to help with a few concepts here. So the first question that we wanted to focus on is, how do you define a healthy pinyon juniper woodland? So this is something that we've sort of asked folks in a number of different settings and throughout the West. And I think it can be something that's a little bit hard to answer because it hasn't necessarily been clearly defined in the literature. And it's also, you know, it really depends on where you are and what type of woodland you're in. So we wanted to get our panelists' perspectives across the Intermountain West on this question. And so we'll start with Jean, and then we'll hear from Peter and Ellis. So yeah, how would you define a healthy pinyon juniper woodland? And
Thanks,
Jean,
Laura.
can
you go ahead?
Your
Yeah,
slide.
just go ahead and show the first slide. So I was delegated to kind of give the overview in terms of the distribution and definitions that we use in these systems. So as we all know, the term pinyon juniper woodland has been used to describe really almost any area with pinyon and juniper trees on it. If we're to manage for healthy pinyon and juniper ecosystems, we need to first recognize that there are multiple species of pinyon and juniper across the western U.S. Both where they are located on the landscape and how they respond to wildfires and management are strongly influenced by climate. These maps are from an initial Rami et al. 2009 paper that many of you are probably familiar with, show that the amount of summer precipitation strongly influences where you find the different species. The red areas in both maps receive most of their precipitation in winter and very little summer precipitation. The orange and yellow areas receive 15 to 35% of their precipitation in summer, and the blue and turquoise areas more than 35% of their precipitation in summer. Now, if we look at where the species are, western juniper occurs largely in Oregon, where there is little summer precipitation, Utah juniper across Nevada, Utah, and then into Colorado and Arizona, where we have intermediate summer precip, and then, as we were hearing from Ellis, one seed and alligator juniper in Arizona and New Mexico, where there is strong monsoonal influence. If we look at the second map, we see that Rocky Mountain juniper occurs across really the northern states in the Intermountain region, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and down the Rocky Mountains. Single leaf pinyon, also on that second map, is found largely in Nevada, while two needle pinyon is found across eastern Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico, where there is that strong monsoonal influences. Now, managing for these healthy pinyon juniper systems also requires clear definitions. And let's go ahead and show the second slide, Mariah. Commonly used definitions are, and I'm going to provide some alternatives here, are persistent or old growth woodlands, encroached shrublands, or as we see here, wooded shrublands, and then also savannas. What this figure really points out is that our shrublands typically have winter-dominated precipitation, and this is where we find our deep-rooted shrubs, like our sagebrush species. In contrast, savannas have a summer-dominated precipitation regime, and they're most often dominated by rhizomatous grasses, like our grama grasses. Now, persistent or old-growth woodlands can be associated with shrublands or savannas that have adequate water availability to support both the establishment and the growth of the trees. Persistent woodlands in the shrublands that I'm familiar with are typically located on ridgetops or relatively steep side slopes, and they have shallow, coarse, or rocky soils. They typically have old trees that can be many hundreds to even thousands of years old, or they have evidence of old trees in the past, like large downed wood. Ecological site descriptions provide a consistent framework for classifying and describing both the woodlands and the shrublands. Many of you are probably familiar with this. They were defined and essentially developed by the NRCS. What they do is to differentiate the different types of woodlands and shrublands based on their climate, soils, and then their plant communities. The state and transition models for each of these ESDs illustrate the different ecological states or plant communities that can exist, for example, if we're seeing infill into an old growth woodland or encroachment into a shrubland, or if we're seeing invasion of annual forbs and grasses, or we're seeing changes in our fire regimes. We recently developed that guide for identifying and managing old growth pinyon and juniper woodlands. And in it, we've described the uses of ESDs and STMs to help determine if a site is a shrubland or woodland, and to use this information to help select appropriate management treatments. I know Janie Montblanc already posted it in the chat, so if you're interested in it, you can find the URL there. Thanks, and I think we're ready to move on to Peter.
Thanks. So the word healthy is so hard to apply to ecological units at a greater scale than the organism, but I'll give it a shot here. So I view healthy PJ woodlands in the Great Basin, at least particularly, as having landscape heterogeneity, so being characterized by mosaics with different woodland patches with varying density, structure, successional stage, as well as patches of understory vegetation that are not dominated by trees. So in the picture that we're looking at from the Shoshone Range in central Nevada, we can see on the north-facing slope on the right side, northeast-facing slope on the right side of the picture, there's an area of trees establishing in recent decades into a former burn from a wildfire that we dated back to the late 1800s. So there's this patchiness associated with the fine scale disturbance regime of small but high severity wildfires and biotic disturbances like beetles and root rots. So you end up with complexity at that landscape scale, and we have a valley with mostly sagebrush bunchgrass vegetation. And off to the right, just outside the picture, is a patch of old growth woodland with some of the oldest trees I've ever dated, over 800 years old, that simply hasn't burned in that long, in that part of the landscape, which partly got lucky and partly there's a big rock outcrop right there, which serves as a fire barrier. Stepping down to the stand scale or the site level scale, a healthy woodland would have structural complexity, so variation in tree ages and sizes and local neighborhood densities, canopy gaps and clumps, dead wood, kind of at that fine scale level. A healthy woodland would have high regeneration potential. So that would include cone production, as well as the advanced regeneration of seedlings and saplings that are available to establish in the overstory following mortality events to trees that have established. And of course, it would have a diverse understory vegetation component with native perennial species and also native annuals. Intact ecological interaction among flora, fauna, and microbes are all going to be important. And I guess management appropriate, with this in mind, might include silvicultural approaches that would foster an uneven aged, patchy structure to the woodland, as you might expect given a patchy and fine scale disturbance regime. So that's my effort to try to encapsulate what I think of when I think of healthy in the context of pinyon juniper woodlands. And it's a pretty subjective thing, I'll admit that. So, okay. Ellis, are you next on this one?
Yeah, I'll provide a different framing of health in terms of potentially fire regimes. As a fire ecologist, I think about fire a lot, and depending on which type of PJ you're in, depending on the fire regime and how long it's been burning or has burned, then that may provide health. So in a savanna ecosystem, similar to what you're seeing in the photo, where there are native grasses throughout the system, then those systems likely, as a fire manager would know, grass burns and likely had fire within them. Whereas persistent PJ woodlands, which we also have, not too far from this photo, where it's rocky, no surface fuels, really old trees, those systems, you go walk around and you don't see any charcoal, likely may not have burned for 4 centuries, and that may be a healthy system, whereas a savanna system that may not have burned for the last 100 years may be unhealthy in terms of losing that ecosystem process. And the last thing I'll say, with invasive annual grasses, you're seeing this transition through fire regimes to what's likely unhealthy, where you have fire in systems that may not have burned at the scale that we're seeing now and the frequency, and it's transforming PJ. So that's another way to think about PJ health in terms of fire regimes.
Yeah, so we're really thinking about, okay, when we're thinking about a healthy woodland, knowing what type of a woodland we're talking about, right? And that will help us think about sort of the variability that we might expect across multiple scales, from sort of a site scale where we want different sizes and ages of trees and a diversity in the understory and some of those more site scale components, to across the landscape, having a bunch of different types of woodlands and types of vegetation. And so I think, that variability is one of those common themes that we talk about a lot. So as we transition to the second question, we've talked about sort of these different PJ types, the different ecological states that may be possible at a given location. And we really wanted to zoom in on what we refer to as sort of the ecotone between Pinyon-Juniper woodlands and other plant communities. And like folks have mentioned, and as I'm sure you all, experience on the landscape, everything's kind of all mixed in together. And there's a lot of places where we kind of have these transitions. And where, over space and time, we expect to see sort of different vegetation types. So one of the challenges at these ecotones is that this is one of the places that we see the most management, whether that's for wildlife, for fire risk, for fuels reduction, to protect communities. So we're seeing a lot of focus on those ecotones. And so we wanted to ask folks sort of what they find the most helpful in answering the question, what vegetation could we expect in a given place, knowing that throughout time, many of these ecotones are fairly dynamic, and that we often see different types of vegetation. So we're going to start here with Peter to talk a bit about kind of those dynamics, those ecological dynamics, and then we'll hear from Diane about how we think about that in terms of addressing those dynamics in management. And Peter, I believe you have a photo. Yeah, do you want that up right now? Okay, then I'll stop sharing for a second. And if you need the photo, just go ahead and give me a shout out.
Okay. Well, that's another really hard question, but another really good question, of course. I mean, I'd say that in the ecotonal area, as elsewhere, the balance of tree cover on the landscape at any one point in time reflects the historical legacy of disturbance, changing climate, and human influences. And that's the case today, just as it's been, for past millennia. So there's this dynamic tension between and among the vegetation types within the ecotone, and the location of the ecotone itself is continually shifting, often uphill and downhill. So the question can't really be answered using just a single snapshot in time, but it requires a longer term perspective spanning from the distant past to the uncertain future. So in the past, you can look for evidence of historical fire, tree harvesting, or other land use. For the future, we can model the future potential response of vegetation to climate change and altered disturbance regimes. On the other hand, within limits and with great caution, we can identify some parts of the landscape that are more likely at any given point in time to support PJ. So in the central Great Basin, these would include higher elevations, steeper slopes, where there's often shallower and coarser grained soils, and areas that are generally less prone to fuel buildup or frequent fires. On the other hand, you can find persistent or old growth woodlands to occur under a great variety of environmental conditions. And we can't avoid oversimplifying, and there's no substitute for observations that are made at the local site. We can't just use models. So the other point I want to make is that we also can't simplistically assume that where we see dense and rapidly increasing or expanding woodlands, that it represents expansion woodlands as the outcome of a human-caused process following, Euro-American settlement. So what looks like woodland expansion can really represent a reestablishment following historical deforestation or historical wildfire. So that's where I want the slide. Mariah, thank you. So this slide, there it is. This shows a charcoal platform or charcoal pit from the 19th century. It shows fairly large pieces, large logs from old pinyon juniper trees that have been cut to length and left on the site. In most such locations, these would have been burned to produce charcoal. This is a very rare watershed where they built the charcoal platforms, cut the wood, and didn't finish burning all the wood to create charcoal. They kind of stopped halfway and left this wonderful evidence of these historical practices. But the point that I want to make here is, if you didn't see this wood there, and if you didn't recognize the charcoal platform for what it is in the absence of the dead wood left on the site, and these are hard to recognize if you don't know what you're looking for, and if there isn't wood left on the site, it would look like a very dense expansion woodland because it's been coming in mostly in the 1900s. It has high density. People would call it a phase 3 expansion woodland, but it's really the woodland recovering from a period of historical deforestation. So that's one thing to watch out for, or it could be. We can also have recent expansion that's due to other influences that might not necessitate the same management response, like trees establishing where climates have become more favorable. So it's a climate change adaptation on the part of the woodland, or they could in fact result from human-caused post-settlement influences like fire exclusion. So there are all these different possibilities, and it requires careful observation and field visits to sites in order to differentiate among them. So I probably used more time than I should have. I'm sorry for that. Diane, it's all you.
Well, I think Peter teed that up really well. These systems are so dynamic, and they're dynamic on a time scale that is really hard, at least for me to comprehend. Maybe everyone else is thinking in, a 1,000-year time frame, but I just can't think quite that big. So if we keep that in mind, that these are slow systems, slow to adapt, it is harder to pinpoint, okay, what should be there? And so then I think we have to think, what could be there and what are we going to try to manage for? So the what could be there, that gets into what Jean was teeing up with the ecological site descriptions. What is that site capable of supporting? What are the soils, climate, topography capable of supporting? What were the historic disturbance regimes? And then from a land management perspective, a big thing that I think about, and Peter mentioned this also, what has the human use been? What are some of the human land uses that have been impacting these sites? And to describe those, I think of it in kind of 4 different time periods. And again, these are really old systems. So the 4 time periods that I'm thinking of are pretty minuscule compared to how old these systems are. But I kind of break those up into pre-settlement and indigenous use. Before 1850 is a nice benchmark if you want something discrete. And with how widespread these communities are, they are homelands to many different tribes and indigenous peoples, all with their own relationships to these systems, with their own uses and practices. So we're still putting together a lot of the pieces on that. The next would be post-settlement. So think Homestead Act and the influx of Euro-American settlement. And this time period is really important to see how the landscapes started shifting but also this is what informs our current land ownership patterns. So as people were coming in, they were primarily choosing areas near water sources or where they thought they might succeed with irrigated or dry land agriculture, or where they were going to be able to support grazing, primarily sheep and cattle in that time period. So we started seeing a lot of manipulation of these sites, especially in the ecotones where you had more grass, more forage component, and that's where people set up shop. And then throughout time, as those large ranches have been subdivided and sold, this is where we have wild and urban interface. So that legacy is important in more ways than just one. After that, you kind of get into the early land management phase. So this would be post-World War II. You start seeing a lot of machinery becoming available and affordable. So this is where you start to see those really large scale treatments like chaining, like seeding, like plowing. And definitely the legacy from that is felt, I'd say, pretty widespread across the range. A lot of this was done in Great Basin, Colorado Plateau, eastern areas, and a lot of this work was done to support grazing. So now we're seeing a lot of legacy of those treatments, and we don't necessarily have the same objectives as we did, as managers did during that time frame. So coming back into these systems with a new approach, with new objectives, it can be challenging, but that's an important part of our practice, is to realize the impacts from those treatments. And then that kind of gets us into the current management time frame. Think of it from 1990s to now. I feel like we know a little bit more. Still a lot to learn, but we've also learned a lot. And I think we've also seen some of the implications from those historic land uses and practices. And we're realizing that in some places, maybe that wasn't the right strategy. And now it has pushed us into a stable state that maybe isn't ideal. So part of current land management has to be realizing, what is the legacy of those treatments? What are our objectives now? And are those realistic? Sometimes to move things from one stable state to another takes a lot of time, energy, money, resources, and you might not have a lot of success. So where can we accept these landscape changes? Where can we direct future disturbances? And recognizing that, as Peter mentioned, this is dynamic. There's attention to all of this. There's trade-offs to all of this. And there's probably not going to be any one right answer. I think we're all out of slam dunks. So now we're left with kind of some of the challenging land management questions out here in systems that are slow, arid, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, so I think really just, when I think of this question, I think of sort of looking to the past to look to the future, right? So what can we learn from the past, from what has been done, from sort of the ecological dynamics that we've seen, and how can that tell us about what might happen in the future, and using the tools that we have to help us understand what vegetation we might have at a given site if we do various management approaches. And that will be sort of, I think, one of what we'll get at a little bit in this next question. So our third question is a little bit shifting gears, but this is something that's come up a lot in this group, which is understanding the effects of different pinyon juniper treatments on fire risk. So there's been a lot of interest in sort of treatment effects in general. But for this question, we want to talk about what we know about the effects of various pinyon juniper treatments on fire risk, and how this information can be used to determine how treatments are applied to the landscape. So we'll go first to Jean to talk a little bit about sort of what we've learned from various large-scale research projects addressing some of these questions. And then Diane's going to talk about this a little bit from the sort of management and operational perspective. So Jean, go ahead and jump in.
Sure, thanks. Most of the information I'm going to share is from a recent review we did of the effects of fuel treatments on our sagebrush ecosystems in pinyon-juniper woodlands. And I'd really like to begin by emphasizing the importance of the inherent ecological resilience, that recovery potential of the site, as well as its resistance to invasive annual grasses in determining the outcomes of our pinyon and juniper management treatments. What we know, and this is a very simplified version, our recovery potential and resistance to invasive grasses is typically going to be higher in our cooler and moister systems. These have more diverse and productive plant communities. They burn more frequently in the past. They recover more quickly. They also are more resilient because of the cold temperatures to those annuals that are invading these systems. The other component really is that where we have residual perennial grasses and forbs, we are going to have a higher recovery potential in these systems. And in our sagebrush shrublands, this tends to be between 15 and 20%, depending on the environmental conditions of that site. These are all important in terms of competing with those annual grasses and forbs and ensuring recovery when we go in and remove trees and shrubs. The next point is that treatment type can have a significant effect on our site recovery. As we know, prescribed fire is a fairly severe treatment because of mortality not only of the trees, but also of understory species, particularly sagebrush, if we're dealing with sagebrush shrublands. It's going to be most effective in higher resilience and resistance areas. Mechanical treatments, things like mastication, cut and remove, cut and leave, are less severe, and so they can be conducted in those warmer and drier areas with a little lower resilience and resistance. One thing to note, though, is that regardless of treatment, seeding is going to be required where you have depleted understories, where you've essentially lost those understory perennial grasses and forbs. Now, treatments can also have longer effects on fuels and fire behavior. We know prescribed fire typically removes crown fuels, but fire behavior modeling from our SAGE STEP project shows that a potential trade-off is increases in fine fuels to the recovery of those perennial forbs and grasses and increased fire spread during the next fire. Another factor is that mechanical treatments that place the woody fuel on the ground, things like cut and leave, lop and scatter, remove those canopy fuels, but they also can greatly increase ground fuels and consequently fire intensity and severity during the next wildfire. Cut and remove treatments or cut and pile burn takes away those woody fuels. These are particularly important when we're looking at encroached shrublands in the later stages of succession that are denser and have more tree biomass. It's also important in persistent old growth woodlands that are experiencing infilling. It's much less disturbing. Spatially dispersed mastication is really an option in these areas as well. I wanted to wind this up by saying that we've created fuel treatment response groups for Great Basin shrublands that are experiencing pinyon-juniper encroachment, and the shrublands in general, actually, and that we've also developed detailed treatment criteria for 2 of our Forest Service high-priority landscapes, the Elko Front and then also Pine Valley in Utah. The treatment response groups and treatment criteria are based on the ecological type. Is it a persistent woodland or shrubland? What is the climate? What are the soils? The environmental characteristics, and then also their relative resilience and resistance. These also are based on the current vegetation composition. They're intended really just to help provide the information needed to determine what the most appropriate treatment is going to be based on an understanding of what that likely response is. And with that, I'll turn it over to Diane.
Thanks, Jean. Jean touched on a lot of important points, the trade-offs, some of the different treatment types. And before I kind of follow up on that, I do just want to touch on the concept of risk. What is risk? Because this is something that I think our perspective about risk in these systems has changed over time. So risk is defined as hazard times vulnerability. In these systems, some of the changes that we've seen through time are increased fuel loads, whether that's from infill or natural response to responding to previous disturbances. We're seeing more fuel loads paired with drought. So these fuel moistures are lower. We're seeing more human ignitions. We're seeing expanding wildland-urban interface, and that's not just homes, it's also energy infrastructure, drinking water resources, emergency egress routes, and we have that threat of conversion to invasive annual grasses and overall loss of resilience. All of those factors combined have increased our risk. So we are thinking more about fuels treatments now in these systems than I think we previously did, and especially in persistent woodlands. I think we've been thinking about this in the ecotones longer, and I think we've been prioritizing some of our shrublands, grasslands more and trying to keep fire out of those systems. But now the conversation around these persistent woodlands, I think, has become more elevated because of this. So as we're thinking about different treatment risks, objectives, factors, we are going to match the treatment type to those different treatment objectives. And we normally have multiple objectives. So a lot of times we are working to reduce wildfire risk and supporting for wildlife habitat and supporting for grazing, all of these other land management components. And they're not always going to be equal. Sometimes one is going to override the other. But we have these different considerations and kind of these layers of objectives that we're managing for. So sometimes our focus is going to be removing the fuels altogether, as Jean was mentioning, some of those treatments like cut, pile, burn, prescribed burns in some of our higher elevation systems that have better resilience, or we're going to be looking at just changing the arrangement of the fuel. So leaving on site, and that could be either just a cut and leave, lop and scatter, which if you have smaller diameter fuels, sometimes that doesn't increase the fuel loading quite so much. But for some of our areas that are denser or have larger diameter fuels, we're doing a lot more mastication type treatments to turn those 1,000-hour fuels into 1-hour fuels. So as Jean mentioned, there is a trade-off between rate of spread and fuel intensity. And when we're doing these fuel treatments, sometimes that is a trade-off that we're willing to make. Because when we're doing these treatments from an operational standpoint, it's about giving firefighters options on the landscape. When we have a crown fire that is moving quickly and hot and fast, there's just not much you can do right in front of it. It's not safe to engage that way. So you have to draw a really big box around that area to safely engage. And by that point, you can get a lot of acres burned. It can be very hot and intense at that point. It can have a very high soil burn severity, and your post-fire recovery might be lower depending how dense those fuels are. So by creating some of those breaks and having areas where we have maybe more surface fuels and maybe a little bit more surface fuel continuity, that can give us some additional options for how we engage with that fire. It's certainly a lot easier to put dozer line or even hand line through smaller surface fuels. So that can allow us to be closer to the fire and potentially contain that more. It also opens up options like water drops or retardant. Water can better interact with some of those finer fuels, and retardant can get better coverage on some of the finer fuels instead of on taller canopies. So there are trade-offs. In some places, we we do want to manage for surface fuels. In some cases, we're all right with having a large bounding box and trying to keep fuels treatments very minimal. But the point is that we're trying to create options. And in the meantime, in between when we do the treatment and when there's a fire, we also want it to provide ecosystem services. So we want to make sure that when we're doing these projects, we're also supporting perennial grasses and forbs and minimizing the vectors for invasive annual grasses to come in or other invasive species. It's not just cheatgrass, we also want to manage for other things. But these are some of the trade-offs that we're thinking about and talking about. And another piece of or area of the research that I'm interested to learn more about and maybe see a little bit more is the risk associated with Ips beetle outbreaks. I think that some of the research is pointing to, maybe there's a short period of increased risk where it's kind of the brown needle period. And then after that, risk seems to subside a little bit. And I would just like to learn a little bit more about that specific risk factor, that dynamic when it comes to wildfire risk reduction.
Yeah, thanks, Diane. I think that would be a great topic for a future session. And I appreciate kind of those complementary approaches of like looking at sort of the ecological and fire risk effects, and then, what's the reality on the ground for the folks that are trying to suppress these fires when we do get fires. And I'll mention that there's a lot of resources addressing sort of some of these topics, ecological site groups, treatment response groups, other approaches and ways that folks have sort of used data to sort of predict and suggest what treatments are appropriate where. And so we'll make sure to follow up with some of those. We're slightly behind here. So we have one sort of final question, and this question is really meant to sort of allow the panelists to kind of think about what's something that they would like managers to know. I think we're often sort of framing Pinyon-Juniper Woodlands as a place where we have a lot of knowledge gaps, and that's certainly true. But we also know a lot. And so the question is for the panelists from their area of expertise, what do they most want managers to know? So we're going to go through quickly. I guess my challenge to you is to sort of like wrap that up in about a minute or so each. So we'll start with Jean, followed by Ellis, Peter, and Diane.
Okay, I'm going to change the question slightly to what should we be thinking about? We know these systems are changing rapidly in a lot of areas, both in terms of species invasions, in terms of die-offs within the woodlands, while we're seeing expansion in other areas. So what I think we should be thinking about is where on the landscape are we best going to be able to preserve these systems? We do not have infinite resources to manage fuels and fire everywhere. So what are our priority landscapes? I would say that things that we need to think about is monitoring these more carefully to understand where we're seeing the transitions, where we think we can maintain these systems into the future, and then maybe to focus a bit more on those systems with lower vulnerability that we are going to be able to maintain in the future. And the other aspect of that is something that the sagebrush folks have been thinking about. Where are our high integrity systems? Which systems are going to be able to support associated wildlife and, say, other priority species into the future? And so I would just suggest that we think a bit more and use the available climate change literature to start to identify those areas and to increase our focus on them.
Thanks, Jean. I want to start by reiterating that this thing we call PJ varies immensely across Western North America. It's kind of unfair to lump it all in one bucket when you have these species that are so different in different climates. And so really think about where you are, as Peter said, get out on the ground and think about the processes that ultimately work in these systems. Even in northern New Mexico, we actually have sagebrush. With PJ, we've got these persistent woodlands where there's like 1,000-year-old juniper snags, and then we got these savannas, all very close. And so you can't even just wrap it in a bucket. When I'm talking to managers here, you got to really think about what's going on in the systems. And then I'm a bit of a PJ management curmudgeon. I have to say that from an ecological perspective, many of these systems may not need management. That is, they may not be departed from historical processes. In some places where you're seeing PJ getting wiped out by bark beetles, you may not be able to do anything about it. And so, of course, certain objectives may override that, fire safety and other things. But think about these systems and where they have come from and where they're moving, and what the processes are that are acting. And I'd last say that I always tell managers, just be careful to think about whether any management can catalyze invasive annual grass invasion, because we know that that's completely transformed systems. And so think about that. Use literature to understand the potential for that. But that's a very important one. Thanks.
I'm up next. These are all great points, and they make me feel like my points that I thought of are pretty pedestrian, but I'll go through them anyway. I feel like it's important for managers to be able to identify old growth woodlands or persistent woodlands, and to recognize that persistent woodlands do not necessarily currently have to host old trees to be persistent woodlands. It's not the same, old growth and persistent. A second thing would be to be able to detect the evidence of historical land uses where they've shaped the landscapes that we see today, but you often have to look pretty hard and know what you're looking for to see the evidence of that. A third thing would be to be aware of silvicultural tools that are woodland or forest-focused tools for increasing resilience to fire and drought in woodlands that are managed. Even while I share Ellis's concern about the need for active management in woodlands in many cases, but I feel like we don't have as good a handle, and we need to experiment for situations where we do want to actively manage woodlands. We just need to do adaptive management much more than we have. And a fourth thing, PJ throughout this region, all the different PJ types are just burning down with all these fires that we're having, and there hasn't been much focus on restoration of the woodland component. So best practices for reestablishing pinyon and juniper trees, along with the native understory vegetation that comes in after fire. We also could use a lot more knowledge, but we know a lot, but we're not applying towards getting trees back on the landscape where they burned. So that's all I had.
Yeah, great points by all. And I'm very encouraged by conversations like this and learning networks like this. And I think what you find with all of this is there's a lot of different perspectives coming into Pinyon-Juniper management, and how people view management in the Great Basin versus the Colorado Plateau versus when you start moving east. They're going to change a lot. And I would just really encourage people to be curious about what other people think about this, how they're managing it, how they see the priorities. And I would also just encourage people to think about, the conversation around Eastern cedar in kind of the grassland states as you head out east. It's a very different conversation, but you might be talking about juniper or cedar, and someone else is talking about something very differently. So I think just staying curious, be open to conversations. Just know that the management situation is going to vary pretty widely, but have the conversation anyway.
Awesome. So I'm gonna go ahead and unspotlight our panelists and ask folks to turn on your cameras if you're willing and able, and sort of join our conversation here. We'll start by sort of answering questions. So if there's any questions about any of the questions or any of the responses from the panelists, if you have something directed towards someone in particular, or if you just have a general question, we'd love to hear from you. So go ahead and raise your hand, and we'll try to move through those. And we'll kind of just try to transition it into more of a discussion. So you don't have to have a question. You can also just have a comment. But if folks do have questions, let's see if we can get some of those answered. So anyone want to be the guinea pig to go first? Go ahead and come off mute if you've got a question or a comment. Got a few folks.
I have a question. Daniel West, I'm a biologist at the BLM in Southwest Colorado. I just wonder what you know about pinyon scales. How widespread is it? And we're noticing it throughout the field office, and we're sampling trees and sending it to an entomologist, working with them. But do you have any information on that?
Do any of our panelists have experience with pinyon scales? Would you like to respond? Or do we need to get another expert on that topic? But it's no one's jumping up to answer that one. We might have stumped them already.
I could actually speak to that a little bit. Landmore, I'm a field specialist with U.S. Wildland Fire Service. I was the state field specialist for BLM New Mexico. We've dealt with needle scale here in New Mexico quite a bit, and it kind of runs in cycles. And a lot of times it's associated with drought. It's one of those initial disturbance things that happen. Often, if you combine that with drought, you end up with, your ips bark beetles that'll start to come in as well. Really not a whole lot you can do with it on scale, on scale, on a large landscape scale, individually around homes and things like that. There's some things you can do. Usually working with a forest entomologist or your cooperative extension, they can kind of help you people answer questions on that. But as far as at the landscape scale, it's just one of those things you just kind of have to watch. And the main thing is that you try to, if you can, do some management in your stands where you've got a healthy woodland that can withstand it. What'll happen is they'll look a lot like they're dead. They'll look like ghost trees. And then as you get those preset patterns that start to come back and you get better precipitation, they'll come out of it. So it's needle scale typically doesn't kill it. What does kill it is either drought or bark beetles, but it does stress the trees out. And the needle scale actually hits the older needles first. So if you look, you'll see just that little tuft of green right at the end of the branch. And like I said, it looks kind of gray when you look at it, from a distance, but when you get up close to it, you see there's actually still some green on it. It's just most of those older needles are going away, and basically they're sucking the juices out of those old needles is what it is. So, but do the best you can to give those things a chance, as far as giving them room to grow, making sure that, whatever situation you're in, whether if it's a PJ savanna, you might want to thin a little bit to kind of get a little more spacing between your trees. If it's a persistent woodland, on those steeper slopes, probably, like I said, not a whole lot you're going to be able to do for it. But yeah, that's what we've experienced down here.
Great, that's very helpful. Yeah, and I think we've been keeping sort of pest, insects, disease in mind as a topic for a future session. So yeah, happy to kind of follow up on that. Anyone have any other questions for the panelists? Something that you thought of while we were discussing? Anything you want to add to the conversation?
I wouldn't mind asking if I may. Or
go ahead.
I work for the California State Office, BLM, and I've also worked in Nevada. And one of the things that I've heard
many times is that the forest needed to be thinned, and that would reduce competition and make the forest somehow better. And I do agree in certain areas that it might help potentially, depending on the fire movement, wind and slope and all that, help to reduce fuels, but it's complicated in my opinion. But does this thinning, how does it impact or benefit PJ woodland in general? Is that something we should be spending federal dollars on?
Peter or Diane, would either of you like to address that one? I know you're both involved in one project that is looking at some of those questions. And Peter is a co-author on a paper thinking about thinning among other approaches in Pinyon-Juniper woodlands.
Yeah, Alan, I'll take a stab to just kick it off, and then Peter can kind of fill in anything I missed. It's going to depend what the primary objective of your treatment is. If you are just trying to go for woodland health, and that is the sole objective, you have a funding source that supports that, then you might try it on a really small area in your specific area first and see if you're getting the objectives that you're looking for. And we are trying to understand implications of thinning on woodland health and looking at moisture in surrounding trees, understory growth that's coming in, a variety of other metrics to try to understand, what thinning approaches best support the system that we're trying to support, and is it worth it? In addition to doing some fire behavior modeling. So I would say start small in your area, see if it's worth it, and ultimately align your treatment with your objectives. Peter, is there anything that you want to add kind of with what we're looking at in the Dawson project?
I'll add a couple things quickly, both from the Dawson project perspective, but also from other research that I've done. We do know empirically that there's a greater, at least for many already dense pinyon-juniper woodlands, there's a greater probability of tree dieback in places with a greater local density of trees. Maybe we don't know yet how that translates to what happens if you start with that dense woodland and then you thin trees. Do you end up with less dieback? It's a different question in a way, but they're related to each other. I do think it's important at this point to invest in projects that explore, like the Dawson project does, how thinning in different ways might influence tree health during or following a period of drought. I feel like we're at an important juncture where we wish we knew more. We have a few studies which have started, which we're analyzing the data. We do need carefully controlled, well-designed studies that are long-term studies to be able to look at this. So I think results are encouraging that it might help so far. Effects on the water balance really need to be elucidated in more detail, with regard to the whole water balance. And some studies like ours are trying to do that. So I think there's promise and potential, but it needs research. I do think it's worth investing in, especially if done as in an experimental adaptive management kind of framework.
Thank you. It's wonderful.
I would just jump in and say that it really does, to me, kind of depend on your objective and the system you're working in too. Are you working in an old growth persistent woodland, or are you working in an encroached shrubland? Those are likely to have very different outcomes. And where are you on the landscape? Is it relatively cool and moist, or are you in a pretty dry area? So I guess that just reinforces the need for more work to better tease out all the differences that we might be seeing.
Right, and take time to make those decisions based on, characteristics, It's a great point. Love it.
Awesome. I see a couple of questions in the chat. Ace had a question about the use of herbicides for removal of junipers, particularly in overstocked areas, and how often those are being used. Anyone have experience with the use of herbicides to remove junipers?
I've seen that more on private lands. That's less common, I would say, on the federal land practice. I am familiar with a certain amount of it being done privately, though.
Yeah, I would say from our review, they used to use quite a bit of tebuthyron to go out and treat the trees. But as you're saying, Diane, we didn't see much evidence that that's ongoing now in the encroached shrublands or persistent woodlands at all.
I would say it also just depends what your objective is. If you just don't want the trees to be living anymore and want to save your chainsaw blade, maybe that could be the right approach. But if your goal is to reduce fuels, you're still going to have that material on site. So again, it comes back to what are you trying to achieve? And that may or may not be the right tool for the job.
So yeah, let me jump in here as well. In New Mexico, we've actually used the tebuthyron in places, but it's more like an encroached savanna situation where it's moving out into traditional grasslands and trying to knock stuff back in those situations. So still used somewhat, not as much as we have in the past, but we still have that kind of in our toolbox, and just it's got to be the right situation. Typically don't try to use it in those persistent woodlands because it's just not the right situation.
That's very helpful.
I've
Andrew,
got
go
a
ahead.
bigger picture question here coming in the Q&A. This is less of like a science management question, but since we have Diane, I'm going to put you on the spot around funding and policy related to Pinyon-Juniper woodlands and their management. Just wondering with, the new wildland fire service and shifting priorities and emphasis on timber and executive orders and all that stuff, like what do you, and you don't have a crystal ball, but what do you see sort of the future of opportunities for funding and policy to support good ecological management of PJ woodlands?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm certainly anxious to see what our next budget is going to look like. I think that's going to answer a lot of the questions. But I also think that it's going to continue to support a lot of the objectives that we've had in the past as separate agencies. Wildland urban interface is going to continue to be really important. We will continue to have that as a priority. Creating features on the landscape that are going to improve wildfire response, safety, and effectiveness is going to continue to be a priority. What we're also going to see is consistent with the executive orders that have come out for this administration in terms of timber, but also supporting other land management objectives and managing for multiple resources. We're going to be able to continue to support wildlife. There are still executive orders in place that support big game, habitat connectivity, and management. These are going to continue to be important. I don't know what the dollar amount's going to be. I don't get to decide that. But no matter what those priorities are, we're going to be able to continue to support multiple objectives. And I think that's going to continue to be an asset under this new agency, and looking forward.
Thanks, man.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on that topic, funding policy related to Pinyon-Juniper woodlands and how we sort of continue work, maybe broadly in these systems as priorities do sort of shift over time?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think in the short term, we're probably going to see an emphasis more towards things that are pointing towards community and infrastructure and protecting those things. I know from my perspective and a lot of the folks that I've talked to on the fuel side in the Southwest geographic area here is we're pushing to not forget the back 40 kind of stuff because we've seen too many fires come out of the back 40 into communities and impact that critical infrastructure. So, still trying to send that message out. We'll see how that plays up the chain because of the way the priorities are going, with some of the leadership that we've got now and some of the shift that we've got into the new agency. But definitely going to try to continue to push that forward as long as I know I will, as long as I can.
Okay, I'll ask a question of the panelists. Peggy Descoville from Taos, New Mexico. Wondering if we know, like, a lot of the pinyon juniper thinning in our area is happening in the wildland urban interface. And it's a bummer for the people that live there because they moved out there to be around all those trees. And then the trees are kind of getting mowed down around them. Do we know, like, what is the minimum we need to take out to make those areas safe for that community? Is there such a thing as that?
Since I'm in New Mexico as well, I can answer that one. It depends. Depends on the stand. The thing that we try to do, even when we try to thin in the wildland urban interface, is not just have, like a block cut in the standard spacing. We're not trying to make it look like a park. We want to leave some clumps, but maybe a little more room around some of those clumps. Not have a straight line, like with fuel breaks and things like that, so much as kind of make it meander a little bit so that, you're not seeing a gun sight down a property line or something like that. So that's the thing that we encourage. Obviously, it comes down to who's setting the project up and the manager and what they want to see happen. So sometimes we still do get that, unfortunately. A lot of times it's just that education piece that we get people out there to be able to see that. And also having that input from members of the public as well when those projects are going on, just saying, hey, what are you going to do to make this look as natural as possible while still providing that benefit? So I think continue to ask those questions because, as you know, we have turnover at the agencies and new people come in and sometimes they go back to the old way of doing things. And it's just an education thing to kind of try to make that look as natural as possible and not look like a park that somebody's trying to manage out there.
And I'll just add on to Van's comments. We do a lot of management in the wild and urban interface, and we get a lot of interest, whether it's in Taos or in other places around the West. And there are certain design features that we can use. We can feather in edges, leave a mosaic of age classes. We can make it also visually appealing. Not all fuels treatments have to look like a bad haircut. Like, we can make it look nice. And I hope that people will also keep an open mind that some of these treatments can also really help express forb diversity and grasses, and those can be also very visually appealing. And I hope that people would be open to seeing that side of the ecosystem as well, and understand that we're trying to go for risk reduction so that they can continue to enjoy those systems. I'm the same. I live in wildland urban interface, and I have certain things that I want to see as well. So hopefully we can just have really good conversations with the public, get that input, and turn that into good design features on the ground.
Any other questions in the audience? Anyone have anything on your mind? We can, kind of move towards just a little bit of a more general discussion here if there are any additional thoughts. And if not, I've got some wrap up that we can do as well. And since nobody's jumping up, Ellen, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to get, and I know you touched on this somewhat, this topic, but we have a practice in the BLM. We have a national salvage team. And although I'm not really well versed in all of the tasks that they do, some of it is sales of timber from downed trees. That's a large part of it because it generates income. But as a as an ecologist, I see this as a disappearance of a lot of the nutrients and resources that, go towards supporting the rest of the forest regrowth and enhancing the soil. And what do you think about these impacts? Are they negligible, or is that something that should be amended, or what's your thoughts on that? And I'm sure, Diane, you all probably do a lot of that kind of salvage also in your line of work, perhaps.
In terms of downed material, I think it depends what that material is. Is it more on the pinyon side or more on the juniper side? Because pinyon does tend to break down a lot quicker than juniper. Quick is a relative term. It still takes a really long time for that to happen and to be contributing kind of to the soil and to some of the mycorrhizal there. But juniper is so persistent on the landscape that it is hundreds of years before that is going to be a real contributor. So I can see some of the questions there, and I think some of the value that they have is actually as large woody debris to kind of serve as nurse plant features, provide shade to seedlings, habitat to animals, things like that. But the soil breakdown maybe isn't quite as much of a factor in those areas where we're doing those sales. And those sales are just not super widespread. So I wouldn't say at the landscape scale that's going to be quite as significant.
Gotcha.
Great.
Thank you very much.
I think I'm going to wrap things up here. I've got one last slide and just want to get, hopefully you'll hang on just for another minute here so that we can get your feedback. We mentioned a lot of different information throughout this session. So if there's something you'd like to know more about or that we can follow up on, please let us know in the chat and we'll make sure that we share that information. We also have talked a little bit about another topic that we need your input on. So in various other sessions, the idea of sort of a Pinyon-Juniper resource list has come up a number of times. So this is something that in the past has been worked on by various groups to compile peer-reviewed literature and things like that for Pinyon-Juniper woodlands. So I have a short poll that I'm going to launch really quickly. And so if this is something that you're interested in, please respond to the poll. We really want to know what type of topics you'd be interested in. Do you see a need for this type of a product? And if you'd be interested in being involved in providing sort of guidance or feedback on that. So, is there a way we can sort of bring together a lot of resources, peer-reviewed science, other types of resources, as they pertain to Pinyon-Juniper woodlands? And if so, what types of topics would you like to see? So we really want these things to be useful to you. So as much as you can kind of give us that feedback, we appreciate it. And while you're filling out that poll, just one last reminder is for our next session, we'll be focusing on pinyon jays on August 27th. The focus will be sort of on understanding the current state of the science on pinyon jays. So what do we know about pinyon jays and how they use the landscape? What information are we learning from ongoing research? And what are some of the knowledge gaps? So we'll hear from the Pinyon Jay Working Group as well as the Fish and Wildlife Service range-wide conservation agreement and strategy effort. So 2 different efforts to sort of bring folks together on Pinyon Jay conservation and habitat work. So if you have not joined our mailing list, you should definitely do that. I'll throw the link to the website in the chat one more time if you are a new person. So please join the mailing list because that's how you'll hear about our future sessions like this one and get the link to register. So with that, I would really just like to thank our panelists for such great discussion and for putting a lot of time and thought into these questions. And please reach out to me or with any additional questions or sort of thoughts on the sessions and future work. I think there's always a lot more questions that come out of sessions like this, and I think that's a good thing. So we're really hoping to sort of, you know, continue that conversation. So thank you everyone for joining.